On the next Probably True Solar Stories, we're going rogue for a mid-season bonus episode. Instead of the strange and wonderful fictional solar stories that we usually tell, we're going to share some strange and wonderful, really true solar stories from actual solar workers and solar industry leaders. Welcome back to Probably True Solar Stories. I'm your solar storytelling host, Tor Solar Fred Valenza. If you're a regular listener to this podcast, you know we tell fictional solar stories from various genres. Check out the archives at probablytruesolar.com for your favorite solar noir, solar thriller, solar sci-fi, solar superhero, and other favorites. But in this between-season episode, we're going to share some really true solar stories. That's right, this is the real deal. There are around 279,000 solar industry workers today, and about 40,000 of them came to the RE Plus convention in Anaheim, California in September 2024. And some of those attendees came to my annual Social Views and Brews happy hour that I host with the support of the generous and beautiful people who run RE Plus. Thank you. Not only did RE Plus provide us with kegs of delicious beer and food, they also sent over a camera crew to record some really true solar stories. And just in case anybody had any stage fright, I gave people 3 prompts to jog their really true solar story memories. The first prompt was, the person that I'll always remember from my years in the solar industry is fill in the blank. Next one was, the funniest thing that ever happened to me in the solar industry was when... And the third prompt was, I remember when I first got hired in the solar industry. And people describe what happened. Some people took those prompts home and submitted their stories later. But the good news is that we recorded 14 really true solar stories, and that's what you'll hear on this episode. In alphabetical order, you'll hear stories from Gwen Brown, Tom Chaney, Ian Hoffbeck, Nico Johnson, Peter Kelly, Ryan Mayfield, Spencer Meeks, Jigger Shaw and Jeff Wolf, Greg Smith, Jeff Spees, Sean White, Jim Wood, and Ben Zentara. Then at the end, I'll tell you about the one solar mentor that I'll always remember and appreciate. First up, let's listen to Gwen Brown's really true solar story about her first job. Today, Gwen is the Vice President of Communications at the Interstate Renewable Energy Council, aka IREC. IREC is a terrific organization that develops regulatory policies, supports solar workforce training, offers technical assistance, and does much, much more. But Gwen's first job was at a small solar startup called Aurora Solar. That's now a huge solar software design company. But back then, she wrote a ton of educational solar content for Aurora's blog. Here's how Gwen remembers her first day.
Hi, I'm Gwen Brown. I'm Vice President of Communications at the Interstate Renewable Energy Council. And I remember when I first got started in clean energy, it was in 2017. I was working for what was then a small startup called Aurora Solar. I was doing solar software development. And in terms of whether it was easy or hard, a little bit of both. I remember really drinking from the fire hose in terms of understanding what was actually happening in clean energy, how solar panel installations work, a lot of the engineering concepts. But it was also a great experience because it is what gave me my start in solar.
Next up is Tom Chaney, sometimes known as the Solar Curator. Tom's first solar job was as an editor for PV Tech. That's a UK-based solar publication that's now one of the top global solar trade publications. When PV Tech hired Tom as their North American editor, he had a front row seat reporting about the early solar industry and what's commonly called the solar coaster, the ups and downs and twists and turns. Tom saw a lot of those. Here's Tom.
Hi, I'm Tom Chaney, and I'm currently unaffiliated, but previously I worked in the PR and marketing space with many solar and storage companies. And before that, my first job at solar, which was as the North American editor of PV Tech and Photovoltaics International magazine. This was in the late 2000s into 2010, 2011. And during that time, I was very focused on the manufacturing wave that was going on in the United States. Most of these companies were thin film photovoltaics, concentrator photovoltaics, from First Solar, who most people have heard of, to many companies you may have never heard of because they're all gone. I have in my phone a list that I call Solar Roadkill. And it is a list of all of these companies that I can remember that I met with, talked with at trade shows and the like, who unfortunately went to their early graves. And so I was fortunate. It was very interesting. I learned so much. I came out of the semiconductor industry into solar and getting a chance to see all these facilities, and also not just the United States. I did tour some facilities in Europe and in China, including companies that did survive, but it was quite something. And one in particular stands out in my mind right now, Unisolar, or ECD. They were based outside of Detroit, Michigan. They made an amorphous silicon flexible panel that was created in roll-to-roll processing, like newspaper rolls or something like that. And I saw their factory. This machine had all this rolls of material on one end, and it was almost a football field long. And at the other end, having gone through all these vacuum processes, it was completed. Unfortunately for them, it wasn't the most reliable product, had really low efficiency, and they did go out of business. So there you have it. My first job in solar. It was quite a ride.
Speaking of the global solar industry, we have a really true solar story from Ian Hoffbeck. Ian has had a very exciting career building solar projects in the developing world. In this really true solar story, Ian was building a 1 megawatt project in Afghanistan and had to use some creative diplomacy skills to avoid getting arrested. I'll let Ian tell you the details of this really true solar story.
My name's Ian. I'm with Future Solar Industries, and I thought I'd tell you the story about how I had to avoid getting arrested at a solar installation in Afghanistan. So we were doing a 1 megawatt electrification project in central Afghanistan. The city didn't have any electricity, and so we came in and built a power plant with diesel and battery backup and got to build a low voltage distribution grid for them. We were working on this project for a while. The EPC I worked for was not enormously organized and started to fall behind on their payments to their subcontractors. And so it was a Christmas break. My boss and all the other foreigners had left the project, and they put me in charge of just holding on to things for 6 weeks while the boss was gone. In that time, the local town of about like 30,000 people heard that all the foreigners had left, and they had some outstanding accounts that they hadn't paid off yet before they left. And so people started to get a bit nervous. So some of the accounts found out that I was still there and came to kind of like force us to make payments. So one of our construction subcontractors wanted to get paid, and so they went and talked to the local police and said, hey, you need to come and arrest this one foreigner that's left in town because they haven't paid us. So a very friendly police officer comes into our compound and says, hey, I need to arrest this guy. So I went and hid in the office and barricaded myself in there and said, I'm not coming out until my boss can figure out how you're going to get paid. I'm not going to go with you to the jailhouse because I don't know how hard it's going to be to get out of there once you bring me in. And so the police officer very nicely sat outside and had some tea while we waited for 6 to 8 hours. I was calling back to the headquarters from the EPC, trying to get them to make a payment, and they were able to wire in the money that night and get our construction contractor paid. The next morning, some other people from the town had heard that the construction contractor was able to shake us down and get their payments paid immediately. And so some more people showed up on our doorstep hoping to shake us down again. And so this was from like the local bakery and the local wood supplier, like very, very small bills. And I had a few $1,000s left in the safe. And so I said, look, y'all, I'm happy to pay you. I have a few $1,000s left in the safe. I'm here for 2 more weeks. If none of your cousins or your friends come and try to shake us down, and only you two come back to me in 2 weeks, I will fully pay you off. I have enough money for that, and I have enough money for nothing else. So please tell everyone to leave us alone. We are going to come back. We are going to pay our bills. But like, I need to be able to get on that plane in 2 weeks. And so 2 weeks come and go. The people come. And so as I'm walking, I paid them about half up front. And then as I'm walking out to the plane to take off and fly home on the tarmac, I went and handed them the other half and said, okay, thank you very much. I'll go get on the plane and leave. Unfortunately, then there was a snow delay and the plane didn't take off. And so I had to spend the next 2 days hiding out in my friend's house, hoping that no one else had heard I was still in town and wanted to shake me down for more money. Eventually, though, I left, we came back, we finished the project, everyone got paid. But yeah, I think that was the friendliest attempted arrest I've ever been involved in.
And now for something completely different. Peter Kelly is another veteran clean energy PR pro who stepped up to the mic. Peter tells the story about the time he brought a wind energy client and his dog to the RE Plus convention. Fun fact, 2024 was actually the 20th anniversary of this convention. The location changes every year, but we often come back to Anaheim, California. Next year, it's Vegas. Anyway, here's Peter.
So the first time I came to the Anaheim Convention Center was when I brought the American Wind Energy Association here in 2011. And we had farmer Tim Hemphill and his dog 3 stories high on top of this convention center because he had leased his land for wind turbines. He had 4 wind turbines on his land. And he said, I wish the whole farm was covered with them. And I love that guy. When the dog died, we sent him a condolences card about the dog.
All right, next up is a very notable solar industry voice, and I mean that literally. Nico Johnson is one of my dearest old solar friends and the founder and host of the Suncast podcast, which is approaching 1,000 episodes. The Suncast podcast is not only filled with true solar stories, but a lot of insights from the people that Nico interviews. Before his podcast, Nico was a pure solar pro, and he remembers his first solar customer and installation and the friendship that came out of it. He also tells the story of his race-to-the-finish experience installing the first 100% solar-powered newspaper facility. Finally, Nico tells the story about how he decided to take a solar job because he read an article that I wrote in Renewable Energy World. And then that inspired something else to happen, which I'll let Nico explain.
Hey, Tor. In my earliest days as a solar entrepreneur, in the very earliest months of the California Solar Initiative, I was running a startup company called Blue Line Power out of Marina, California. And our first 2 customers still stand out to me as though it were yesterday. I remember sitting down with Mr. Campbell, my very first customer, 3.4 kilowatts, Mitsubishi 190s and SMA Sunny Boy 3000. I remember getting the check from him in his office, and that feeling of realizing this guy had just entrusted a part of his savings, his life's work, to me and my company, and that we were helping him achieve energy independence. And Jim Campbell became a friend. I later spent numerous afternoons and evenings hanging out at barbecues in his backyard where he would admire the solar array that we installed on the barn in the backyard. It was easily visible from the place where we had a barbecue and just outside in his patio. But that array stands out to me for 2 reasons. Not only was it the first that I ever installed, which really gave me the confidence that this is something worth doing and it makes a meaningful impact in people's lives. But one of the guys who was then working at a Central California company called Acro Electric was a foreman. I think he was a foreman, Michelle Hyde. Many, if you've been in the industry for a while, would recognize the name Michelle Hyde because he's been in the industry as long as I have. I think Michelle is he's from Scandinavia. I want to say Denmark, but I'm not exactly sure. So I don't want to misspeak. But Michelle and I have been friends this entire ride since 2006 when I installed Jim Campbell's, I should say better, when he installed Jim Campbell's solar array as an employee for Acro Electric. And every time we see each other, we still remember Jim Campbell's 3.4 kilowatt system on his barn in Carmel Valley, California. And how, for us, it was not only the beginning of our careers, but the beginning of a long-standing friendship. Just this past month at RE+, Michelle messaged and said, hey, we should get together. And it was nice to get that nod from a longtime friend that even though we don't see each other regularly, when we try to get together and convene as an industry, we can always get together with our friends. And it has been such an interesting journey where over the course of the nearly 2 decades, Michelle and I have had numerous different jobs. He has been almost a decade now at Enphase, but we still are working in service of helping elevate this industry and educate those who want to be a part of it. So that's the intertwined story of my friendship with Michelle Hyde, probably one of my longest standing friends, along with Todd Michaels and a handful of others that I met in the early days of Blue Line Power, that first company. Another great story that was the first deadline I had to achieve was Bradley's Eve. It became the first 100% solar-powered newspaper in the United States, the Monterey County Weekly, 34 kilowatts, so 3.4 to 34 kilowatts. And A couple of local companies had tried to give this guy a deal on solar. They had procured his self-generation incentive program and had dropped the ball entirely on getting the project completed or installed or even getting him a contract. But they had helped him secure his SGIP incentive or rebate, which was quite lucrative. And he had 40 or 45 days to get it done. Acro Electric again helped us install. Unirac delivered one of the first fully ballasted Unirac rooftop projects in the US to this project. And among the many things we did wrong completely is we had no idea what a built-up bitumen roof was or why all those rocks were up there. But what we did know is that they were in the way. And we had no idea they were ballasting down the roof. They were actually, in fact, part of the roof system. So early in my career, I committed what roofers would consider the cardinal sin of putting solar on a roof where we actually literally moved all the rocks off the rooftop of this building, thus voiding the roof warranty. I think Bradley knows that now, certainly didn't know it at the moment. But I was on vacation while it was getting installed because the timing worked such that I already bought tickets. And so my then company co-founder and business partner was pulling his hair out trying to manage the project execution over a pretty frantic 40-day period where we did, in fact, pull off getting the project to PTO, permission to operate, in time for Bradley's Eve to get his SGIP rebate. And the moment that I walked out of his office with a check for north of $200,000, literally prepaying the entire project, one of our conditions for agreeing to go forward because we needed to buy all the equipment, that was the moment in my career where I felt probably the first moment where I really felt proud that I had accomplished, selling something of that magnitude to a business owner who, beyond Jim Campbell trusting me with his 3.4 kilowatt system, which was very familial and very personal, Bradley Zeev looked me in the eye and he literally said some expletives along the lines of, "Don't screw this up, kid." He acknowledged in my late 20s that he was handing a very big responsibility to a young entrepreneur. And I've never forgotten that. So he probably may never hear this, but thank you, Bradley Zeev of the Monterey County Weekly, for trusting me. Thank you for Jim Campbell as well, trusting our young fledgling company. I'm grateful for the lessons that I learned in that and many other projects along the way that were early real solar cowboy moments in what we pretty quickly began to refer to as the solar coaster. And from 2006 to now, I've learned an awful lot about the art of storytelling and the way to integrate that into creating great narrative for this industry. But early in those days, we were just trying everything that we could to help compel and convince business owners and homeowners that this was the right thing and that there wasn't a better date or time in the future to wait. That narrative remains true today. And I'm so grateful for all of the solar warriors that have been on the front lines of this clean energy transition for all these years, rowing alongside us. And if I could tell a third story, and this one as well is pivotal, it is about a time when I was just getting into my business, thanks to the global financial crisis, had not weathered the storm, and I needed to seek a job. And I ended up having a really, really great opportunity to work for a company in Northern California that ultimately led me to a company called Trina Solar. And very few people knew Trina at the time. And the only thing I knew about Trina was from an article that I'd read of this guy, Solar Fred. And Solar Fred, a moniker that today still stands as one of the greatest in the industry, was a journalist intent on sharing the story of the solar revolution. And he'd been invited by Victoria Vestal, at the time running marketing and communications for Trina North America, to travel to China, a privilege that many of us have still yet to enjoy, and to visit this world-class, first-rate automation facility that was the Trina manufacturing facility. And I feel that that article that Tor wrote, which I believe was published either in Solar Power World, Renewable Energy World, maybe it was Green Tech Media, I can't recall at the moment. But that was one of those sort of ground-shaking moments where I became a believer that the Chinese solar panel manufacturing process was worthy of our attention and time. And I went on to work for Trina and was a part of the team at Trina that helped take Trina to #1 in the global market share. And I can truly say that I don't know that I would have trusted the opportunity and the offer to go work for Trina if it weren't for Tor being invited and taking the opportunity to go to China to do the on-the-ground research for me, to compel and convince me that this Chinese company might be, more than just smoke and mirrors. And I should really put aside my judgments of that sort of the way the industry was leaning towards these Chinese manufacturers like Suntech and Yingli and Trina. And that decision fundamentally changed the trajectory of my career. So thank you, Tor, for being one of the people that I'll never be able to forget or thank enough for helping move me in a different direction. Thanks to the Trina folks, Victoria, Michael, Greneau, and so many others who helped provide an opportunity for me to really see the industry at a macro level, like we say, 30,000 feet. And it is because of that experience at Trina that Suncast was born. It's fun to be able to tie those connections together. Thanks, Tor. Appreciate all the work that you're doing. And thanks to all the solar warriors who tune in to your show.
Nico, if you ever get the time to listen to this, all I can say is that I'm so glad I could help. And I'm even more glad that you started Suncast. Thanks for inspiring so many more solar people to tell their really true solar stories. Now let's hear some stories from Ryan Mayfield, who answered all of our prompts. If you don't know Ryan, shame, shame, shame. He's such a great resource for the solar industry. He's the founder of Mayfield Renewables and one of the most respected solar engineers and educators in the industry. If you're watching this episode on YouTube, you'll see a lot of old solar panels hanging on Ryan's office wall as art. He's that kind of solar nerd. And as you'll see, he got into the solar business for the pure joy of it.
So the person that I always remember from my years in clean energy, there's way too many that I want to mention, but I'm going to pick two if I can. So one is Johnny Weiss from SEI. So Johnny was probably my first, I would say, real instructor for a PV course, and just his enthusiasm, his love for teaching, just everything about what Johnny embodies for the industry is just something that stuck with me from the very first class and something that I really, truly appreciate. The other person is Roger Ebbage from Lane Community College. He gave me an opportunity to do some training, some teaching at the college, and really set me off on a path that I didn't even know was going to happen for me. So those two were instrumental pretty early in my career to get me going. So those would be the guys I'd have to say that I remember from my time. The funniest thing that happened to me in my clean energy career, this one still comes up at every single conference, it feels like. One of the very first conferences we went to, watching one of my coworkers get tackled and pulled down to the Las Vegas jails in the casino for lighting up a joint that he mistook for a cigarette on the dance floor at a club there. So still 20 plus years later, the folks that were there, and I always get a good chuckle when we reminisce about that one. So good times there. And then you asked about the first time to get hired in the industry, and was it easy or hard? And I completely lucked out. I had actually just turned down a job for doing some work for the county, doing some energy efficiency stuff. And my wife told me, if you're turning work down, you better get out there and get a job that you really want. So I started cold calling installers, really only 2 installers at the time in the town I was living in, and got one of them on the phone. And that morning, his one employee had just given notice. And so it was just one of those serendipitous things, called at the right time. I was ready to work for free. I was going to offer up doing some work for free just to get the experience. And he offered me a whole $7 an hour. And so I was over the moon, making $7 an hour when I was going to work for free. So that was my first job in the industry. Felt relatively lucky to get it.
Our next really true solar story comes from Spencer Meeks. Spencer is the principal at Apex Presentations and fellow solar communications pro. But in this video, he tells a few really true solar stories about his first job working for Solar World. That's an old solar manufacturer that has since gone out of business, but his experience there had a great influence on Spencer's solar career. Spencer also tells us a solar rat story. Actually, maybe not quite a rat. I'll let Spencer explain.
Okay, so the person that I'll remember most from my career, from my years in clean energy, is actually a guy named Bjorn Seipel. He was a German man, emigrated to the US, and was actually my first employer at a company called Solar World. Solar World, I think, kind of angered a lot of people in the industry by advocating for import tariffs on panels because they were an American manufacturer. But Bjorn was super pragmatic, got everything and anything done underneath the sun, and really gave me a chance to get my career started in the industry. I got a master's in semiconductors and photovoltaics, but there really wasn't any other options for how to get jobs working in panel manufacturing. But gave me my first start, was a super compassionate boss, and really gave me an opportunity to grow into my own as a professional in this industry. And for that, I'm forever thankful to him. He actually ended up heading up the largest module manufacturing facility in the Western Hemisphere during the time, which was around, I think, like 2014. But unfortunately, passed away a couple of years after that. So kind of this is a bit of an in memoriam. Bjorn, thank you so much for giving me my start, and hope things are good for you wherever you're at. In terms of like the funniest thing that's ever happened to me, so again, worked at a company called Solar World, large module manufacturer. At one point, a nutria got into our panel manufacturing line. You're not familiar with what a nutria is? Imagine a rat and a beaver crossbred, and has like, it's the hugest rat. It's a rodent of unusual size. So it got onto the production line and started just like peeing and pooping across all of this like production facilities where people need to laminate solar panels. And we had to shut down the production line and clean it out for like 2 days afterwards. And it was just absolute mayhem to have this enormous rodent running through the middle of things. We talked about it, laughing our asses off for like years afterwards. Yeah. Last question is, I remember when I first got hired in the clean energy industry, what happened? Was it easy or hard? So I kind of went like the academic route of getting a graduate degree in it and trying to get hired at this module manufacturing facility. But the reason that I got hired was I could work with a piece of chemical analysis instrumentation, something called an ICP-MS, which just like analyzes the amount of chemicals, or sorry, the amount of given element are in like chemical baths or that are on wafers or what have you. And so I got started there as a result of an internship, which was great. Bjorn was the person who hired me, Bjorn Seipel. And I had to learn the hard way that I love science and I hate doing it. So I ended up spending my favorite moments of that job giving VIP tours of our facility to installers and to local politicians, things like that, and got to like discover more and more of my professional self in that job. So I think the pathway was relatively straightforward, but I really got lucky insofar as having the background working on a piece of chemical analysis instrumentation before getting a job doing precisely that at a solar company.
Next up, we have a tandem story told by two solar veterans. If you're in any way related to clean energy, you know the name of Jigger Shaw. Whether it's from SunEdison, the first company to offer a solar power purchase agreement, the Energy Gang podcast, or most recently as the head of the Department of Energy's Loan Programs Office under President Biden. In 2025, Jigger's now on a new podcast called Open Circuit with the old Energy Gang, Catherine Hamilton, and Stephen Lacey. I could go on and on about Jigger's accomplishments, but let's get to the story. Jigger goes down memory lane with another famous early solar entrepreneur, Jeff Wolf. In 1998, Jeff co-founded Grow Solar with his wife, Dory. Reflecting its name, Grow Solar grew to become the first national residential solar installer. In this segment, Jeff and Jigger remembered Brian Robertson, their mutual solar friend who died in a plane crash at age 38. Here's Jigger and Jeff.
All right. So, Jeff, we met in 2002?
2002, yeah.
Three? All right. And then we both have a common friend, Brian Robertson,
Yes.
who joined SunEdison to basically bring it up to, frankly, like next level. Without Brian, there was no real SunEdison.
Yeah, I think I
Right?
met him before I met you.
You did. So he was at Harvard Business School. We met him because Clara Broido Johnson refused to listen to me. And I told her, no way, I don't need any validation from Harvard Business School. But she applied to the case competition anyway. She needed a student sponsor, and that's how we met Brian. And Brian turned down the top job at Yahoo. It was like the number 6 job at Yahoo to join SunEdison because he was fascinated by solar. Why would he be fascinated by solar?
So in 2001, I got a call on my phone at my 3-person solar company, Grow Solar, and said, hey, I just bought some land in Baja, California. I want to put solar on it. And then the message ended. And he left his number. And I called him back, and I was sure that when I told him it would cost more than $2,000, he'd hang up. Well, we put a large or mega system down in his property in Baja, California, 18 kilowatts. And
Those were mega projects.
we actually invented an inverter with ABB, model number 1, serial number 1 inverter off grid for his project. And I spent many weeks installing. I was installing myself with another guy,
Yeah.
Dan Kenny, and had a bunch of bottles of wine with Brian and talked about
I've,
solar.
I've
and the
been to
future
his
of
house
solar.
there, and
Yep. Fascinating solar, and talked about the goodness that solar is going to be. And then he went back to Harvard and created a solar job for us to do on one of the buildings there, Shad Hall.
yeah.
We did a project at Shad Hall with Brian. And,
Well,
and then he went on to do amazing things.
and I think there were like 10 other houses on that strip that his house was on. So he was selling power to all of those houses. And I think he like basically charged them, I think it was like 25 cents a kilowatt hour during the daytime. And then it was like 60 cents a kilowatt hour any other time, because then you had to like use the batteries and whatever. But off grid was a real thing back then.
Off-grid was the only thing back then, especially in Southern Baja. Yeah. I mean, back in those days, almost every job we did was off-grid, and every job we did had batteries.
And then you basically created Grow Solar.
Yeah.
And
Well, myself and my wife,
and you grew it and you sold it
twice.
and you didn't sell any batteries during that period of time. And now we're back to batteries.
Better batteries. Better batteries. Batteries that don't make holes in my jeans from the acid.
Well, in any case, we miss you, Brian Robertson.
Yeah. He was a
And,
great guy. Great.
It's always great to
founder.
reminisce about you.
Yes. Thank you.
Thanks.
Our next really true solar storyteller is Greg Smith. Greg is the Global Director of Learning at Tigo Energy, but his first solar job was at SMA, an inverter company. Back then, Greg would try to help customers having technical issues, and one day, he got a call that tested his abilities and his reality. This is a really true solar story, but it could have been one of my fictional, probably true solar stories. Here's Greg.
Hey, everybody. My name is Greg Smith. I'm the training director at Tigo Energy. And I got in this industry in 2008, right? Back when I was still young. And I started with SMA. I was right out of the Navy. And I was a sonar tech. I'm like, well, sonar, solar, one letter off, how much different can it be, right? And I started with SMA as their technical trainer. And after 2 or 3 months of working there, one of the guys in the service department who I've worked with service, I have worked for service the last 16 years. I'm very close with them. And he said, hey, Greg, there's a lady on the phone. We need you to take this service call, because I was still learning the inverter stuff. And that's just the best way to learn, is get hands-on, pick up the phone, right? You never know what's going to be on the other side. And so I got this lady on the phone, and we had just launched the HF inverter. And the big thing about this was that it had Bluetooth capability, right? You could just connect to it. And I'm like, cool, right? Welcome to the 21st century. And I get on the phone with this lady, and she starts cutting into me. I mean, like my ex-wife. I didn't even do anything. And she's going off. I'm like, okay, lady, hang on, what's going on? And she said, this inverter that you guys sold me, my neighbor is stealing my power via Bluetooth. I'm like, okay, first of all, I don't think that's possible. And I'm like, have you called before? Yeah. And I talked to this person, I talked to that person, and that person. And I'm like, oh, okay. And I stood up, and back then, all the service people were in this like little bullpen environment. And I stood up, and a couple of them were like, yeah, it's your turn. So she just made her rounds because nobody knew how to help her. It's like she would not listen to reason. There's no way anybody can like steal the inverter power via Bluetooth, but she wouldn't have. So that is one of my earliest memories of just the crazy stuff that has happened in this industry.
This next really true solar story is literally about how the modern residential solar industry got started. My good friend Jeff Spees is the co-founder of Planet Plansets, but that's just his day job. He contributes a lot of time to solar advocacy and technical organizations, but his true passion is telling the history of the solar pioneers who started the modern PV industry. In fact, Jeff's finishing up a documentary about those pioneers called Solar Roots, which should be released soon. In this solar pioneer story, Jeff reveals how his first boss and mentor, David Katz, started AEE Solar. AEE was probably the first solar distribution company in the U.S., and one day, David got the attention of 3 oil guys in suits. I'll let Jeff tell the full story.
Hello, my name's Jeff Spees, and many of you might be aware that I was the executive producer for a documentary film about how the solar PV industry started called Solar Roots, the Pioneers of PV. And I just want to tell you briefly a story about how I first heard the story about how our industry started, or at least how I marked the start of the solar PV industry. And one day when I first started working for AEE Solar back in 2007, I was going to a trade show with my mentor, friend, and the founder of AEE Solar, David Katz. And as we were walking through the streets of San Francisco for the NECA show, David told me the story of how he got started in the solar PV business. And the way he told the story really amazed me and really was the kernel of the start of the documentary film that we eventually made all those years later. But the story he told me is as follows. David had moved to Humboldt County. He had worked for the Department of Defense in the Bay Area. He decided that he didn't want to live in the hustle and bustle of the big city, so he decided to move to the remote rural Humboldt County at that time. He bought a 40-acre parcel of land, started his homestead, and to support his livelihood, he was doing work on Volkswagen Beetles. He was a Volkswagen Beetle mechanic. And he started to help some of the folks in the area that didn't have any access to electricity to convert their Volkswagen Beetles so that they could put a second battery in the Beetle and drive it around during the day, charging that second battery so that they could have power in their homes at night. And that was his business, selling 2 battery charging systems for Volkswagen Beetles, or really any automobile. And he had this small business that was called Red Star Automotive. And that eventually turned into a business he started with a friend of his called Alternative Energy Engineering, where they were selling these 2 battery charging systems for automobiles so people could have battery power to run lights and music in their homes. Well, one day he was walking through the Consumer Electronics Show down in Las Vegas, and he came across the booth of this fella that was selling solar PV powered toys and gizmos. And he was intrigued. And he asked the fella about this technology, and he saw behind the booth of this company that was selling these solar toys, this large solar panel, and said, "Hey, what's that thing back there?" And the fella said, "Oh, that's nothing you wouldn't be interested in." He persisted, and he found out it was a 33-watt solar module. And he said, "Hey, I have an application for those." And he bought those modules, took them back to his business in this small rural area in Humboldt County. And he started to sell these solar panels to people that were living in these homesteads scattered throughout the hills of southern Humboldt County. And he had bought several rounds of solar panels, and eventually this captured the attention of Arco Solar, which was still is a large oil company that was selling these solar panels. And they sent 2 guys in 3-piece suits up to Humboldt County to find out, who's this David Katz character and why is he buying all these solar panels? So these guys show up in suits in this little town called Redway, where most of the residents were barefoot hippies, literally. And they started asking around of, "Hey, do you know where we can find this guy, David Katz?" And they thought they were the feds coming to bust David for some kind of illegal activity. Eventually, they got rid of the 3-piece suits, and they found out that David was selling these solar panels to people living in these off-grid homesteads for home power. And I consider that moment the point at which the discovery was made by these large corporations that were making these unusual solar panels that had little to no market, that there was an opportunity to sell solar panels to homeowners for home power. And I feel that was the point at which the modern solar PV industry was born. And that's my story.
Up next is a very fun solar origin story from Sean White. Sean knows just about every solar installer in the solar industry because he probably trained them. He also helps to write the solar and storage codes and regulations for installing solar, not to mention working with several advocacy organizations. I could go on and on about everything Sean does today, but then we wouldn't get to this funny story about how Sean started his solar career in a bathroom.
Okay, this is a kind of a funny story. I was getting into the solar industry, so it was like maybe sort of my first job. It was my first full-time job, let's just say that. And so I was taking classes at the Pacific Energy Center in San Francisco. It was right by the Moscone Center where InterSolar is. And I was networking with people and I was talking to somebody, and I think the conversation went from outside into the men's room at a little break that we had in this class. And I was telling somebody how I was like, I'm ready to get my full-time job in the solar industry. And some guy hands me his card in the men's room. And that became my first full-time job in the solar industry. He had the same last name that I did. His name is Ken White. My name's Sean White. And it led to working at Fidelity Roof Company. And the person that I ended up working with there too was another guy that's kind of well-known in the industry named Stuart Wentworth. And so I learned a lot of stuff from Stuart, and Stuart was learning things from the roofing company. And he started another company that was called Quick Mount TV, and they're very well known, and he invented some flashing and stuff like that. So anyway, the moral of the story is you never know where you're going to get a good job. So I always talk to people in the men's room in San Francisco. That's where you're going to find some really good stuff.
Next up, we hear a really true solar story from Jim Wood. Jim has had a successful career in solar sales and business development for solar panel manufacturers. Today, he's the CEO of SEG Solar, a solar panel manufacturer that's based in Houston, Texas. In this really true solar story, Jim goes back in time before SEG when he was working for another manufacturer in China, and his boss took them out to have some hot pot and to be entertained by a noodle dancer. Yes, a noodle dancer. Like many solar coaster stories, this one has some twists and turns and some irony.
Hey, my name's Jim Wood, and this is my solar coaster story. This isn't a funny story. It's just this tragic, dark humor, kind of terrible story, but it's my best solar coaster story that I can think of at the moment. So I was working for a different module manufacturer. It's probably 10 plus, maybe 15 years ago. And so we're in China, we have a team meeting. So all my colleagues are there, my boss is there, and we do a week of team building. We get kind of towards the end of the week and we do this dinner. And at the time, hot pot is like exploding across China. There's these chains of hot pot that are famous that are kind of popping up all over the place, and it's standing room only. And so we decide we're going to go get hot pot. I had never had hot pot before. Though I'm familiar with the concept, but for those who don't know, hot pot's kind of like fondue. You put meat in boiling flavored liquid and you eat it, and it can be noodles, vegetables, all that kind of stuff. And so we're all having dinner together. My boss is there, colleagues are there, and kind of in the middle of dinner, this guy comes through and he does this thing called the noodle dance, and he's dancing around our dining area, stretching dough and making noodles, and he throws the noodles into our hot pot area so you can eat them. And so I actually have a video of this noodle dancer, which is why this place was famous, because they had a noodle dancer. And so I look over at my boss after this guy's done noodle dancing, and he's purple, like he's like something's going on. And I really wish could say like I was like this super responsive Navy SEAL lifeguard kind of guy. I just looked at him. I had no idea what was going on. So my boss is purple. One of my colleagues looks over and says, he's choking, and jumps up, gets behind him, gives him the Heimlich, and he coughs up something. It's disgusting, but saves his life. And so everybody gives the applause. The whole restaurant's like, oh, you saved his life. And so that following Monday, we're all back in the US. And this guy gets called into the big boss's office, and he gets let go. And so this guy literally saved his life, and the guy fires him on Monday. And it was performance related, and he probably should have been fired before, but because he didn't, he saved this guy's life just so he could fire him on Monday. So that's my solar coaster story. It's a terrible story, but it's like dark humory, kind of funny in a way, but not funny. So do with it as you will. Thanks for letting me share.
We're getting towards the end, but before we wrap up with the person who inspired me over the years, let's hear Ben Zantara's really true story about Jeff Spies, whom we heard earlier in this episode. Ben is a solar industry policy analyst at Solar Reviews, which is kind of the Yelp of solar. Aside from solar policies, Ben also reviews solar products, and that's why he's speaking on a panel at the NABCEP conference. I know we've dropped a lot of acronyms in this podcast, so please check the show notes for NABCEP and the terms mentioned in these stories. Anyway, here's Ben telling a story about Jeff Spies.
Hey, I'm Ben Zentera from solarreviews.com, and I have a story to tell about a person I know and that I'll always remember, and the funniest thing that ever happened to me. I was giving a talk in 2021 or 2022 at the NABCEP conference in Knoxville, Tennessee. I was on a panel talking about the future of net metering, and I gave a talk. I started the talk off of the 4 panelists. I was the first, and I told the story of net metering from the beginning to the end, and was very polite and talked about how utilities are working against solar installers and against the solar industry, and very gently poked at the utilities. And Jeff Spies followed me up. He was the next guy on the panel. And he began his talk by saying, if there's anybody from the utility industry here today, please raise your hand. And a couple of people sheepishly in the corner raised their hand. And he said, okay, where are you from? I said, oh, we're from the TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority. And he said, that's the enemy right there. Those are the guys who are fighting to stop net metering. And I didn't laugh out loud at the time, but my soul was on fire. It was one of the most amazing things I've ever seen. So thanks, Jeff, and thanks for all of the memories.
And finally, I want to tell you about the one solar mentor that I'll always remember and appreciate. His name is Jeff Wolf, and if that name sounds familiar, it's because you heard a story from him earlier when he was telling a story with Jigger Shaw. So here's why I appreciate Jeff.
So I think for me, I'm going to take the prompt, the person that I always remember from my years in clean energy, and that is a guy named Jeff Wolf. When I started in 2009, Jeff was the founder of a company called Grow Solar. And Grow Solar was this installation and distributor that was based in Vermont and went national. But I was a young cub logger, and I got him to be interviewed here at the 2009 SPI, as it is called, Solar Power International. And now it's called RE+. But at the time, I knew about marketing, but I didn't know about solar. And Jeff was just the epitome of a guy who had been around the block and kind of told me all his secrets of how he was building the company and marketing it. And we've been friends ever since. And so that was just a great inspiration that he respected me. Even though I didn't know enough about solar, I just was passionate about it and passionate about promoting it. So thank you, Jeff Wolf. You're a great guy. And I can't wait till you see this or listen to it on my podcast.
Thank you, Jeff, for all your wonderful insights and marketing secrets and stories that you've told me throughout the years. I'd also like to thank all the other really true solar storytellers who contributed to this episode. Maybe we'll do this again, but for now we'll be returning to our fictional Probably True Solar Stories. Thanks for listening. Probably True Solar Stories is a production of Unthink Solar PR and Communications. Be bold for solar, stand out, and educate.